Aloha and welcome to Equally Speaking, Equality Hawaii Foundation's forum on people, issues, and ideas affecting LGBT people and their families. I'm the Reverend Dr. Jonipher Kwong, Minister of the First Unitarian Church of Honolulu. Today we're pleased to have two guests with us, Rabbi Peter Schaktman and the Reverend Kyle Lovett. Rabbi Schaktman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I've been here in Hawaii for about 7 years, most of that time serving as the spiritual leader of Temple Emmanuel, the largest congregation in Hawaii and the only Reformed congregation in Hawaii.
Thank you. And Reverend Lovett?
I've been here about 2.5 years, serving the Church of the Crossroads over by University. It's a United Church of Christ congregation.
Great. So tell me a little bit more about the Reformed tradition. How are your views on LGBT issues different from, say, an Orthodox tradition or a Chabad congregation?
Well, first of all, Reformed Judaism has always been a very progressive religious tradition. So Judaism and its Jewish law are looked at as an evolving system that needs to take into account modern realities and new information. So it's also been a prophetic, particularly prophetic approach to Judaism. So it's always been a very strong commitment to issues of social justice, of equality, of civil rights, going back very, very early. We're sort of being in the vanguard of those sorts of things. So even in terms of LGBT issues, the Reform movement, I can say, really has been always in the forefront of calling for greater rights and greater visibility for LGBT people. Obviously, the way in which the Reform movement talked about this in the 50s and 60s and 70s is very different than today, but always given the context in which the country was in, the world was in, the Reform movement was always in the vanguard, calling for greater visibility and greater rights.
And when would you say that the movement started ordaining openly LGBT rabbis, for example?
Well, so the movement ordained LGBT rabbis fairly early on. You of course put the qualifier open. We trace that to around sometime in maybe the 80s, the 1980s. And what happened was we had a number of rabbinic colleagues who were ordained and later came out, and then it wasn't really until the late 80s and the early 90s that the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the main Reformed seminary really in the world, instituted a policy that formally permitted gay and lesbian students to be enrolled as being out and then to be ordained following their completion of their studies.
Great. And the United Church of Christ, you two have had a long history in this country, and have you always been known as a progressive religious organization, or has there been an evolution in that?
Well, with any denomination and any religious tradition, there's evolution. We come from the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and so those folk fled persecution in England and came via Holland, but they were much more reserved, than many of their brothers and sisters in Christ, as it were. So we've come a long way from the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The denomination now, the United Church of Christ, was the first denomination to ordain an openly gay candidate, somebody who was out in the process. Because of our governance, it was the local church that determined that he was qualified, and then the regional expression of the church, people gathered together that examined him and made the leap in 1972 to ordain him. So it's quite a stretch, although the denomination also goes back to claims the ordination of the first woman, September 15th, 1853 in New York. Yeah, Antoinette Brown, later Antoinette Brown Blackwell. So we talk about the firsts in the UCC, the first to ordain a woman to parish ministry, the first to ordain a black man to a primarily white denomination, the first to ordain an openly gay candidate. So.
And were you the first denomination in America to openly recognize marriage equality as well?
I think that the Metropolitan Community Church probably took that step before we did, although when we did in 2005, it hit the national news in a way that the MCC's move did not. But in terms of mainline denominations or sort of your commonly recognized Protestant denominations, we were absolutely the first. as a nationwide body in, in a deliberative session that voted to recognize and to support marriage equality.
And how big is your denomination?
About 1.2 million members. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 churches. Those are rough numbers.
And out of those 6,000 churches, how many would you say are truly open and welcoming and affirming towards LGBT people?
So we have a particular program, the Open and Affirming Program, and in order to belong to that, a church will have had to make a declarative statement that includes language about sexual orientation and now gender identity and expression. So there are churches that are really nice places to be and churches where people are genuinely warm and welcoming, but to be officially open and affirming, you have to publicly have made this statement. There are, I think, over 1,000, yeah? So, because I remember when we made 10% and everybody was very excited. The challenge is that because of our polity, our governance, every individual local church decides its own way of operating. So it's not like a whole denomination could just, a structure in the denomination would just say, now everybody everywhere welcomes all LGBT folk. Some denominations work that way. The denominations that have a much stronger hierarchy that have said, now we will ordain women, and then women can all be ordained, if they qualify otherwise. So
that makes a difference as well in terms of each clergy trying to find a called settlement.
Absolutely.
And how difficult is it these days to find a congregation that would call a queer person? Do they have to look within the 1,000 churches, or can they even look beyond that?
Oh, absolutely, they can look beyond that. And churches form committees to search for pastoral leadership and set their own criteria or hierarchy of values about what they're looking for. So those of us who are searching for churches turn in our professional documents and they can go nationwide. And any church can request them, or we can request they go to churches. So it's more about finding matches. Churches that say we want these particular characteristics, and then our paperwork also has lists of our top characteristics. So it's an extensive process. It takes like 18 months. Really done well, but once the match is made, it's brilliant.
So would you say the same about your match?
Oh, yes.
How did that process come about?
I'm ecstatic about my match. Church of the Crossroads, as a United Church of Christ denomination church, it has been on the forefront of social justice issues and has been open and affirming for 20 years. It made the declaration quite early in this whole process. The Open and Affirming program is only 27 years old. So Church of the Crossroads is known in this community for concerns about the environment and concerns about affordable housing and concerns about any kind of social oppression or justice issue. So they were already there by the time they were looking for a pastor this round. So they knew what they were looking for. They were looking it wasn't like they were looking for a lesbian, right? They had their list of criteria. They wanted somebody who was a fabulous preacher. They wanted somebody who had strong administrative skills. They wanted somebody who was willing to be out and in front in social justice issues and articulate that in the public sphere. They had their whole list. And that I have the package, right, that includes being an out lesbian was not only, it was attractive, but it was like not a problem, right? There wasn't a disqualifying characteristic that it is actually in other churches in the denomination. So we're a fabulous match. I'm so happy.
And how did the matchmaking work at Temple Emmanuel?
Well, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is one of the partners in the placement system for some years now, has required congregations who are applying for a rabbi, putting themselves out there, to sign a declaration saying they will not discriminate based on a number of things, including sexual orientation. So congregations who participate in that system have to commit to being open to the hiring of a gay or lesbian or now transgendered rabbi. So I had the unique situation of being the interim rabbi of Temple Emmanuel the first year I was here, and in fact I wasn't expected to stay. I was here really to help them find a new rabbi, and did my best to do that, and ended up, for a variety of circumstances, being the rabbi that they asked to remain. And although I didn't know it at the time, and it didn't come up in the process at the time, the board knew that I was gay. They had certainly found that out, and by the time I was actually hired, I made that clear, and it didn't seem to be an issue. It didn't seem to be an issue at all. Later on, it became unclear whether or not the entire congregation shared that commitment. You know, I think that in many cases, what we think in our head and what we know to be right in our head and what we feel in our heart and our gut sometimes can be very, very different and can cause a kind of cognitive dissonance. So although I didn't feel it, I found out later that other people had heard comments and questions raised about my being queer and my suitability as a rabbi because of that. So it later became a significant issue, I think.
There was, for example, that article that came out in the Honolulu Star-Advertiser quoting one member of the congregation apparently saying you needed to go back to San Francisco.
Right.
So what do you take of that in terms of the mixed reaction from the congregation?
Well, you know, I think that first of all, I think that homophobia, as we all know, is a very, very multi-layered phenomenon and exhibits itself in a variety of ways. But I also think that it calls into question the difficulty that probably a lot of queer clergy have in serving congregations, and that is one form of homophobia is just a lack of understanding and an assumption that a pastor of any sort, any faith tradition, really, the pastor's effectiveness is tied to his or her ability to look like the members of his or her congregation in all sorts of ways. It may be that people in the congregation had no problem with a gay rabbi in the abstract. In fact, I'm sure few would say that they did, maybe a few, but only a very small number. But the idea that their rabbi, they felt they couldn't share their lives in the same way because that rabbi had they thought a different life. For some people, may have been a problem. What, of course, it calls to mind is the importance of looking at everybody as individuals and trying to evaluate, you know, their suitability aside from these labels or these categories.
And so, what's it been like being a former rabbi for Temple Emmanuel? And obviously, there was some pilikia within the congregation in order for you to be asked to step down from your position. Well,
my separation from Temple Emmanuel, you know, was in some sense a mutual decision. You know, I think that congregational dynamics are very complicated, and it's often very hard to parse out what actually the issues are. And I think Temple Emmanuel has a history of having a lot of volatility with regard to its rabbis. So, you know, there's no way of knowing for sure. The Temple never said that my being gay was the issue. And in fact, later on, the president of the congregation made a public statement saying that the congregation was open and welcoming to gay and lesbian congregants. He never said that they would be open and welcoming to another gay or lesbian rabbi, which is interesting. It's also interesting, as again in other faith traditions, how the standards can be different for
Yes.
the congregants and lay leaders and lay people, and for the clergy, him or herself. You know, and I think this is true in lots of things. You know, the Reform movement was also in the forefront of granting women greater visibility in Judaism, but and was very committed to women having equal rights and having equal visibility in Judaism. But when women rabbis started appearing on the scene, that was a whole different story. You know, and that's a phenomenon that's common, I think, in evolving social consciousness.
So speaking of social consciousness, would you say that the community overall has been supportive, or have either of you received any hate mails or letters that would vilify you or say that who you are is wrong or a sin?
Yes. Periodically, Crossroads is in the news, is in the newspaper, or is on TV. And almost every time that happens in a fairly largely visible way, we get either emails or phone calls or hand-delivered packets that say, really horrible things about me and about the church and about queer folk, burning in hell and that kind of stuff. So, yes, that exists in the wider community, but that's no news. That's not news for anybody. It does exist in the wider community. We just happen to be occasionally a lightning rod for that. That certainly hasn't dissuaded us from speaking out or speaking up, nor has it really affected, sort of the content of the activity that we're engaged in. But yeah, there are. The world is filled with hate, and the world is filled with broken people and brokenness, and there's a lot of lashing out and demonizing and making other of people. So, yeah, that happens, but that doesn't. It's not like it doesn't mean anything. What it means is actually that we're doing the right thing, that we are making it clear through our public witness, to use our term, through our public witness, that folk are welcome, and that many faith communities welcome LGBT folk. We have, for a couple of years now, sponsored the Witness Our Welcome event on National Coming Out Day on October 11th. Where we invite all of the declared welcoming congregations on Oahu to come together for just a celebration, to say, there's, 3 Lutherans and some Episcopalians and the UU and Reformed Jews and the UCC, the Church of the Crossroads. There's, a unity. There's a variety, and Buddhists and so there's to say to the wider community, and especially to the kids, the young people at UH. There are faith communities of a variety of types that are welcoming explicitly. They say so out loud. So I think that's a really important witness. And yes, it draws the hate mail, but that's such an important message to get out. It's kind of worth it to go when you open the mail.
Right. And so where do you turn to for support and for collegiality? Does it ever feel like you're the only queer clergy in town whenever you're receiving this? And where do you go to for comfort? Other than your spiritual life, probably.
Right. Go to God in prayer. Okay,
right.
So in addition to that, and a deep-seated
Yes.
belief in my worth in God's eyes, B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, I hold that as first and foremost. But there are other colleagues, like yourselves, to whom I turn who have a sense of the differentness, the otherness. There are certainly supportive colleagues who are straight, who are serving parishes and understand sort of the parish dynamic. But the sense of isolation I've found it can get to you, yeah. And there are, as there have always been, closeted clergy, and I have no desire to call them out of their closets. Everybody makes their own choice about how they move in the world. There's a group called CLOUT, Christian Lesbians Out Together. And it was formed because at gatherings, once one of the women came out, the other women wouldn't sit with her, lest they be tainted by the suspicion that they might be lesbian. So there is a unique bond among those who are out and can be together and just talk openly about that. And I certainly wouldn't want to, have questions raised about my colleagues, anybody. But you all, for example, and the other out clergy on the island are folk who get it in a different way.
And being part of the United Church of Christ, there's how many churches throughout the islands? 140, 150,
yeah,
something
130
like that?
or so.
Out of those, how many are open and affirming? And can you go to the other O&A congregations for help and support?
Good question. The open and affirming churches in the Hawaiian Islands, there are 3 of us. We are the only open and affirming congregation on Oahu, which is one reason that we called into being the WOW event, so we can hang with the Unitarians and the Jews and the Lutherans and the Episcopalians and see that we have company on this journey. They just happen to have a slightly different path. There's an open and affirming congregation on Maui, Iao Congregational Church, and there's one on Molokai. But we don't really have much opportunity to mix together as ONA, open and affirming congregations of the UCC. I do have colleagues across the nation, and I thank God for Facebook and Skype and email and national conventions and those kinds of things where we get to hang with each other face to face or be in dialogue on Facebook. I find that very supportive and very affirming. But in terms of face to face, yeah, it's my colleagues on Oahu.
And there's not another Jewish Reform synagogue right now either on Oahu.
In the state.
In the state, wow.
in the
And
state.
how many other Jewish rabbis are there? And do you turn to them for collegiality whenever?
So there are a very small number of rabbis in the state of Hawaii. Only one or two rabbis, and maybe only even one, who's ordained through a mainstream organization, a mainstream seminary. And we are collegial, but we don't really, we're not close, I'll put it that way. They're retired. I'm the only one who is actively working as a rabbi for the most part. So it is difficult. It is difficult to share that. But of course I do have Facebook and I do have Skype and all those sorts of things. So I do have a connection with other queer clergy throughout the country. But it is sometimes very lonely, and that's why I often turn to non-Jewish clergy as support as well, who, especially on queer issues, are able to understand that perhaps maybe better than some of my Jewish colleagues on the mainland. But yes, it is difficult sometimes. It is difficult.
And what would you say to someone watching out there in terms of they're still questioning whether they could be a person of faith and be queer at the same time? From a Christian tradition, what would you tell someone who's questioning their sexuality or gender identity and expression?
So what I would say to them is that there are many voices within Christianity that will tell you that you are not welcome and that you're not beloved by God, but there are other voices that interpret the same texts and worship the same God and are quite clear that God loves you and that you're being a person of faith and a person who has self-identified queer in whatever form that is, are perfectly compatible. Now, not every Christian will tell you that, and not every LGBT person will tell you that it's okay to be Christian. I get it from both sides. Yeah? Coming out as Christian in a lesbian community is often as troubling to the heart as it is come out as lesbian within Christian circles. So, but there are folk. Keep looking. You will find them. They will find you. And absolutely believe that God loves you, that there's absolutely no question about that. I can go into some stories about the biblical self-defense class that we offer, the workshop that we have. You can find it on Olelo. You can find it on the Equality Hawaii website also, linked from there, that goes into some of the texts, but that's about dealing with the text specifically. In terms of hearts, in terms of spirit, in terms of soul, I would say, don't believe the haters, don't believe the lies. You are beloved.
And Rabbi Schaktman, what would you say to such a person?
Well, in the Jewish tradition, I think our issues are a little bit different. Except for some very radical fringe people, I don't think there are any rabbis of any denomination that would tell someone that they weren't Jewish, didn't have the right to be Jewish if they were queer. In fact, in the film Trembling Before God, which came out some years ago, you really saw the film itself portrays a certain level of compassion even among Orthodoxy, and the aftermath of the film even more so. This film was shown in Orthodox synagogues throughout the country and really raised the issue in a way that no one really expected. There were lots of tears, lots of hugs. I mean, the rabbis saw it as an issue of having their hands tied in terms of Jewish law, but there was never any absence really of compassion for LGBT folks in the Jewish community. Where it becomes an issue is in terms of affirmation sometimes, and as is true of gay life in America anyway. So much of what we see in society is, I don't care if you're LGBT, but I don't want you to be proud of it, and there's so you have some of that in the Jewish community as well, of not being willing to affirm it as a positive identity. But that's changing, rapidly. The Reform movement is very solidly, respectful of LGBT folks and their needs. The Reconstructionist movement, now the conservative movement, and even more so, even in the Orthodox community. I know of Orthodox rabbis who will come and as it were, put up a mezuzah on the home of a gay couple, but that being the effect of blessing the home. And they'll come, they'll recognize it. The other thing about the Jewish tradition that's interesting is the Jewish tradition had what we know as the Fifth Amendment long before the U.S. Constitution, which is that when a person says they're gay, according to Jewish law, they can't be believed. You can't incriminate yourself, which means you're not allowed to persecute someone, even if they say they're gay, because on a technical level, they can't incriminate themselves. They can't be punished. So that helps a lot in terms of the way the Jewish community is able to deal with this. And we don't have the kinds of sin metaphors that are so prominent sometimes in Christianity, and we don't have that at all, really.
And how does one get a hold of you if they want to find out more about what it means to be a United Church of Christ Christian or a Reformed Jew?
Well, the best thing to do would be to come to church on a Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m., Church of the Crossroads. I believe that the website can be shown, Church of the Crossroads, Hawaii.org. Certainly come to any of the programs that we have at Church of the Crossroads. We're on Facebook. Call the church, 808-949-2220. Or drop in,
Great.
Drop in and talk.
Thank you. And Peter?
I think that Temple Emmanuel certainly is welcoming of many, many people, and so is Congregation Sof Ma'arav, which is a conservative congregation in town. You can get in touch with me. Probably the easiest way is on Facebook. I have a Facebook page called the Honolulu Rabbis Roundtable, and through that one can get a hold of me or through my own Facebook page. And I'm happy to be of any help to anybody who may need that guidance. So
and so you mentioned Congregation Sof Ma'arav,
right,
and as being conservative.
Right.
What does that mean? Does that mean that they're really conservative?
Not in the political sense. Conservative,
okay.
Conservative in a religious sense, in that they have a more traditional approach to Jewish law and Jewish life. So their services and their traditions are a bit more traditional than in the Reform movement. But Sof Ma'arav has been very welcoming, as far as I know, of GLBT folks as well. So it's also a very very welcoming home for those who find it that way. In fact, I actually know a lesbian couple that's actually becoming more and more a part of that community and very welcomed as such.
Great. And I hear they meet at the First Unitarian Church of Honolulu on Saturday mornings.
That's exactly right.
Any parting thoughts in 10 seconds?
Being a person of faith is consistent with being a person of LGBT orientation and gender identity, and that's all aligned together. There's no disjuncture there.
Great.
20, 30 years ago, I don't know that people didn't think they could be clergy if they were queer. Now we're really on the cutting edge, and I don't know about other movements, but in the Reform movement, we now have a couple of transgendered rabbis as well. So it's really we have to really recognize who we are and be who we are and live in that light.
And we've come a long way, baby. Thank you both for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap.
We're done.